Most groups win fast and fade just as quickly, and ENHYPEN did the opposite, winning a major rookie award just 12 days after debut usually marks a peak, a moment you spend the rest of your career trying to live up to. But 5 years later, ENHYPEN's biggest milestones didn't sit behind them. They stacked on top of each other. That's why this story isn't about a group that peaked early. It's about a group that was quietly being built for something much larger. And to understand why their future looks different from everyone else's, you have to go back to a time when ENHYPEN didn't even exist yet. Because before they were a group, they were a concept. If you're interested in how groups actually build long-term dominance, make sure to like this video and subscribe. More videos like this are coming. In 2019, Belift Lab wasn't created to follow the traditional idol formula. It was formed as a calculated partnership between ENHYPEN and CJNM, two companies with very different strengths and one shared goal: scale. ENHYPEN brought the training system and long-term artist vision. CJNM brought broadcasting power and global reach through Mnet. This wasn't about debuting a group quietly and letting them grow over time. It was about building anticipation first and identity later. That plan became public in 2020 with the announcement of Island. From the outside, it looked like another survival show, but the structure told a different story. The show wasn't just selecting trainees, it was training an audience. Viewers didn't passively consume episodes, they voted, debated, defended favorites, and formed emotional attachments long before a debut date even existed. Every elimination raised the stakes. Every performance created memory. By the time the final lineup was revealed, the audience didn't feel like observers. They felt responsible. That distinction matters more than it seems. When ENHYPEN officially formed, they didn't step into the industry as strangers. They entered with a global audience already conditioned to care, already familiar with the members' personalities, struggles, and growth arcs. Most groups debut first and search for identity later. ENHYPEN inherited attention first, then had the space to define who they were within it. That early advantage created a trajectory that doesn't show immediate peaks. It creates momentum. Momentum that doesn't collapse after debut hype fades, but compounds as the group grows into the scale they were given. And when ENHYPEN finally stepped onto the stage for their official debut, the world wasn't discovering them. It was waiting. When ENHYPEN debuted in November 2020 with Border Day 1, expectations were already unusually high. Survival show groups are often watched closely at debut, but they're also met with skepticism. Many people assume early attention won't translate into long-term support, and ENHYPEN challenged that assumption almost immediately. The debut didn't rely on shock value or trend chasing. Then Taken arrived with a polished, cinematic sound and controlled intensity, signaling that this wasn't a rushed launch. The choreography was sharp, the concept was cohesive, and the execution felt deliberate. Then the numbers started coming in. Albums didn't just sell well for a rookie group, they sold fast. Pre-orders surged past 300,000 copies, an unusually high figure for a first release. Charts in Korea and Japan responded within days, confirming that the audience built during Island wasn't passive curiosity, it was active commitment. But the moment that rewrote expectations came less than 2 weeks later. Just 12 days after debut, ENHYPEN received a Rookie of the Year award, setting a record no K-pop group had ever reached before. That win wasn't symbolic. It was statistical proof that their debut wasn't a test run, it was a successful launch. At that point, ENHYPEN weren't being discussed as promising, they were being measured against established acts. And that kind of comparison, that early, can either crush a group or force rapid evolution. For ENHYPEN, it did the latter, because winning that fast doesn't mean you've arrived. It means the pressure starts immediately, and what came next would determine whether that record-setting start was a peak or just the beginning. 5 months after debut, ENHYPEN faced the moment that defines most fast-rising groups. This is usually where momentum stalls, where expectations spike faster than identity, and follow-ups are judged more harshly than debuts. Instead of playing it safe, ENHYPEN leaned into contrast. With Border, Carnival, and the title track Drunk Dazed, the group deliberately stepped away from the cinematic restraint of Give and Taken. The sound was louder, faster, and more chaotic. Psychedelic synths collided with sharp rock elements, creating a sense of controlled overload. It didn't feel like a sequel, it felt like escalation. That choice mattered. Drunk Dazed reframed how the group was perceived. It showed they weren't interested in preserving a debut image. They were testing their range, even if it meant polarizing reactions. And instead of losing listeners, they gained them. Commercially, the response was immediate. Pre-orders jumped past 450,000 copies, a clear leap from their debut numbers. Then came their first music show win, followed quickly by more, as ENHYPEN swept multiple broadcasts in the same promotion cycle. For a group barely half a year into their career, this wasn't normal progression, it was acceleration. Internationally, the pattern held. Border, Carnival topped Japan's Oricon chart and entered the Billboard 200 in the United States. These weren't just appearances, they were signals that ENHYPEN ENHYPEN's audience wasn't confined to one market or one type of fan. More importantly, this era marked the first time ENHYPEN stopped being labeled primarily as a survival show group. The narrative shifted. They were no longer being evaluated on where they came from, but on where they were heading. And what became clear during this period was simple. ENHYPEN wasn't chasing validation. They were building momentum. That momentum was about to spill far beyond the charts. For most groups, cultural influence comes after musical dominance. For ENHYPEN, the two began unfolding at the same time. Not long after their rookie era, the group started appearing in spaces that typically ignore new acts altogether. High fashion doesn't move on hype alone. It looks for longevity, image control, and global relevance. ENHYPEN checked all three boxes earlier than expected. What made this shift notable wasn't just the partnerships themselves, but the timing. ENHYPEN weren't being positioned as experimental faces or short-term ambassadors. They were being aligned with brands that protect their image fiercely and think in decades, not seasons. Becoming the first house ambassadors for Ami Paris signaled that ENHYPEN had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer idols borrowing luxury aesthetics. They were contributors to brand identity. Their presence didn't feel decorative. It felt intentional. That trajectory reached a new level when they were named Prada Global Ambassadors. For a fourth-generation group, this was more than prestige. It was a statement about trust. Prada doesn't attach its name lightly, especially to artists still early in their careers. And the impact wasn't theoretical. At major fashion events, ENHYPEN didn't just generate attention, they drove it. Media metrics showed that their appearances accounted for a massive share of total brand engagement, rivaling long-established global figures. This wasn't fandom noise, it was cultural pull. What this confirmed was crucial. ENHYPEN's influence wasn't limited to music listeners. It extended into lifestyle, fashion, and global youth culture. They were becoming recognizable symbols even to audiences who didn't follow K-pop closely. That kind of visibility changes a group's ceiling, because once an artist becomes embedded in global culture rather than confined to an industry, their relevance no longer depends on comeback cycles alone. And while ENHYPEN's image was expanding into luxury and style, something even more powerful was happening quietly in the background. Their music was finding a life of its own. In 2022, a B-side quietly escaped its album. Polaroid Love didn't have an official music video. It wasn't pushed as a title. It wasn't engineered to dominate charts. And yet, it stayed. Day after day, month after month, year after year. The general public kept it alive. Streams didn't spike and vanish. They settled into permanence. And eventually, it became one of the longest charting songs by a fourth-generation boy group. That kind of longevity can't be manufactured. It suggested something rare. ENHYPEN wasn't just followed by fans. They were being chosen by listeners who didn't care about fandoms at all. Around the same time, individual members began gaining massive organic traction online. Not through controversy, not through scandals, but through visibility. Clips circulated, performances traveled, names spread. This is where I'm curious. Do you think ENHYPEN's biggest moment has already happened? Or are they still building toward it? Let me know in the comments, because what comes next might change how you see their entire trajectory. And once that digital loyalty locked in, the next step wasn't online. It was physical. Japan doesn't reward hype, it rewards consistency. So when ENHYPEN announced 2 nights at the Tokyo Dome as part of their world tour, it felt unreal to some observers. A venue most artists reach after a decade, not a few years. Both nights sold out. Over 80,000 people showed up, and just like that, ENHYPEN became the first fourth-generation boy group to headline a solo Tokyo Dome concert. This wasn't symbolic, it was economic proof. Awards followed, industry recognition followed, and suddenly, the narrative shifted again, because ENHYPEN wasn't just expanding, they were solidifying. But the most important evolution hadn't happened on charts or stages yet. It happened behind the scenes. During their stadium tour era, members began openly discussing their involvement in production, stage flow, set lists, transitions, musical direction. For the first time, ENHYPEN wasn't just executing a vision, they were shaping one. Fans noticed the difference immediately. Live arrangements felt raw. Vocals took risks. Performances breathed instead of following a script. This is usually the point where groups either plateau or unlock an entirely new level. And soon after, ENHYPEN stepped onto a stage that made everything undeniable. When ENHYPEN appeared at Coachella, it wasn't framed as representation. It was framed as performance. They weren't there to prove K-pop belonged. They were there because they did. Live viewership surged. Clips spread beyond fan circles. Streaming numbers climbed afterward, not just among fans, but globally. At that moment, the conversation changed. ENHYPEN wasn't being discussed as a fourth-generation group anymore. They were being discussed as a global act. And by the end of 2025, the numbers reflected that shift clearly. Multi-million album sales, record-breaking chart runs, major industry awards, including top-tier grand prizes. These weren't projections or predictions. They were confirmations. By this stage, ENHYPEN had passed more than just milestones. They had passed comparison, and instead of slowing down, they pivoted. With the sin vanish, ENHYPEN didn't chase another hit. They changed direction. The sound grew darker, more aggressive, less predictable. This wasn't a group trying to hold on to momentum. It felt like a group testing how far they could push it. After years of building infrastructure, refining identity, and gaining control, they finally reached the point where they could afford to take creative risks. That's usually what separates long-term acts from short-lived phenomena. And it brings us back to the question most people still get wrong. ENHYPEN didn't peak early, they were built early. They debuted with a global audience already watching. They converted momentum into loyalty, loyalty into scale, scale into control. Each win didn't close a chapter, it unlocked the next level, which means their biggest moment doesn't sit behind them, it's being prepared. The only question left isn't if ENHYPEN reaches another peak, it's which moment the world will remember as the one that defined them. Because this story was never about a finished rise, it's about a future that's already in motion. ENHYPEN dared to be bold. The rest is catching up.